Introduction: Musashi, the myth and the man. The truth behind the legend. Saints have no moderation, nor do poets, just exuberance. Anne Sexton. In 1935, novelist Eiji Yoshikawa, 1892 to 1962, changed the martial arts world when he published his epic Musashi, a fictionalized account of the adventures of Miyamoto Musashi, which was serialized in the newspaper Asahi Shimbun. The legendary swordsman was well known to practitioners of classical Japanese swordsmanship, but virtually no one had heard of Musashi beyond that fellowship. Certainly, he was not the mythic figure we think we know today, one who has been portrayed in books, movies, manga, and comics to the point where he has become a household name far beyond the traditional martial arts community. Yoshikawa was a talented writer, one who ignited the imaginations of his readership. Once he created the mystique of Musashi, it caught fire, growing in the same way that virtually all myths are born and developed. Suddenly, Musashi was larger than life, a figure whose methods of thought, strategy, and tactics were adopted across a wide spectrum of Japanese society, especially amongst military leaders and captains of industry. They studied his ancient treatise on strategy, Go-Rin no Sho, intuiting relevance and meaning in modern life. Before long, Musashi's legend spread beyond the shores of Japan, making an impact on people from all walks of life all across the world. In fact, his treatise, Go-Rin no Sho, has been translated into English at least a dozen different times, where it was published under the title The Book of Five Rings, and various derivations thereof. It has also been printed in languages as diverse as Arabic, Chinese, Greek, German, Indonesian, French, Lithuanian, Spanish, and Thai. If Musashi had not written this exposition Go-Rin no Sho and Yoshikawa subsequently publicized it centuries later, it is likely that Japan's most famous swordsman would have been relegated to the dustbins of history along with most other luminaries of his period, known only by historians and historical reenactors. Nevertheless, Musashi retired to a cave near the end of his life, put down his swords, and took up a pen. And Yoshikawa brought those ancient writings back to life. In the process, he is largely responsible for making Musashi the venerable sword saint that he is today. When legendary figures pass away, we tend to turn them into saints, though not necessarily in a spiritual manner. Nevertheless, we do it much in the same way that religious institutions deify noteworthy members of their organizations. The formula works this way. First, while the future saint is still alive, society does not acknowledge his or her brilliance. These individuals are often branded eccentrics, mavericks, or rabble-rousers. Secondly, after they die, we discover their message, recognize their contributions, and adopt them as our own. Thirdly, we canonize them, putting special emphasis on their remarkable deeds and honorable behaviors while ignoring or brushing over any questionable or contemptuous acts they may have performed. No, he wasn't crazy, just a little quirky. Perhaps a touch eccentric. But what genius isn't? Think of all the contributions he made to, we might say to ourselves. Once that justification has taken root and been accepted by the masses, the last stage of canonization takes place when we as a society turn them into saints, and then we build statues of them, name things after them, and pay homage to their memories. And so it was with Musashi. Roughly 300 years after his death in 1645, Musashi suddenly became an icon and a hero. His name is synonymous with samurai ethos, as ubiquitous as katana, bushido, and shogun. In fact, he is often called Kensei, the sword saint of Japan. Musashi is, without doubt, a larger-than-life figure. However, he was not just a mythic hero. He was a real person, too. In studying his writings, it is important to remember that. Before he became the symbol of a bygone era, arguably the greatest swordsman who ever lived, Musashi was a real person, and an imperfect one at that. His icon is an affair of the heart, but to understand his reality requires an analysis of the mind. Who is to say that we cannot hold a perspective about him that blends both heart and mind? Today we know that Miyamoto Musashi, 1584 to 1645, was born Shinmen Takezo. He grew up in the Harima province of Japan and slew his first opponent, Arima Kihei, in a duel he fought at the tender age of 13. Over a lifetime of blood and strife, he killed more than 60 samurai warriors in fights or duels during the feudal period, where even a minor battle injury could lead to infection and death, a miraculous feat. He was the founder of the unconventional Hyoho Niten Ichi Ryu style of swordsmanship, which translates as two heavens as one, or more simply, two sword style. Like most samurai, he was a highly trained martial artist, a veritable killing machine, but he was also skilled in the peaceful arts as well, an exceptional poet, calligrapher, and artist. 2 years before he died, Musashi retired to a life of seclusion in a cave, where he codified his winning strategy in Go-Rin no Sho, which in English means the Book of Five Rings. At an early age, Musashi exhibited the traits of a saint. Legends state that when he was only 8 years old, he left home to learn calligraphy, poetry, and other arts, leaving almost everything behind. Impressive, right? Perhaps, but let's try to separate the man from the myth for a moment. In Japanese society, tatemae, official truth, outward story, often varies from secret truth, inward story. Was leaving home the first steps along a path toward enlightenment in an ascetic lifestyle, or simply a young man running away from an abusive father? At the age of 13, Musashi challenged a famous swordsman, Arima Kihei, to a duel and defeated him using a stick in lieu of a sword. Was this a heroic battle as it is customarily portrayed, tatemae, or did Musashi, through grit, determination, anger, and a burning desire for glory, ambush Kihei, knock him to the ground, and savagely beat him to death? Clearly, we cannot know with certainty what actually occurred, yet we are hard-pressed to think of a less elegant or more brutal way to murder another human being than to pummel them with a hunk of wood. Imagine a young man standing over a hapless swordsman lying on the ground and repeatedly slamming a bludgeon into his victim's face until he stops breathing. Then he keeps pounding on the samurai's bloody pulp of a face to ensure that he is not just unconscious, but in fact dead. And then he walks away smiling afterward, knowing that his reputation has been enhanced. In 1612, Musashi fought another famous duel, this time with Sasaki Kojiro. Musashi showed up 3 hours late. When he finally arrived, both his adversary and the officials of the duel were irritated by his tardiness. Rather than carrying a steel blade, he was once again armed with a wooden sword. This time it was a bokken that he had carved out of an oar. Furthermore, Musashi knew that Kojiro's sword was a little longer than a normal katana, so he spent the extra time to carve a wooden weapon that was just a little bit longer than that, giving him an additional advantage in reach. By arriving late, showing contempt for the opponent and the moment, and then doubling down by not even having the dignity to use a real sword for a life-or-death duel, he rattled his adversary. Brilliant strategy, don't you think? But Musashi went even farther still. When Kojiro drew his sword to get things started, he threw his saya scabbard aside in disgust, prompting Musashi to further unnerve him by commenting something along the lines of, "If you have no more use for your scabbard, you are already dead." Musashi had won even before the fight began, because he had stacked the deck in his favor so effectively. Not only did he use psychological tricks, but he also wielded a longer weapon, something which many overlook in his victory. Remember the scene in the Bruce Lee movie Enter the Dragon, where he tricked an opponent onto a boat and then left him floating without an oar? That was inspired by another of Musashi's dirty tricks. He may or may not have truly been the greatest swordsman of his period, perhaps even of all time, but we know for certain that Musashi was one of the most successful. An unconventional thinker, he often fought with 2 swords instead of 1. He made extensive use of misdirection and psychological warfare, and nearly always cheated in one way or another in order to win. In fact, he was downright brilliant at his job, which, like most warriors who live in tumultuous times, ultimately boils down to killing people efficiently. Unlike others of his era, however, Musashi took the time to write about what he had done, the things he had accomplished, and the strategies that made him successful in his endeavors. That's a vital factor in what we know and think about him today. After all, he's not the only one who lived an amazing life during that time period, but he is one of the few who documented his perspectives on what he had seen and done for posterity. The Book of Five Rings, Musashi's most famous writing, is a work where life experience meets genius. One surefire way to know whether or not you hold genius in your hands when you read it is to have the work span your lifetime regarding its impact. If, for example, you read the classic science fiction book A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle as a child, it's magical. To reread it later in life brings back those magical feelings. That's the mark of a truly well-written book. But is it genius? No, not so much. Let's contrast this with Musashi's work. To read the Book of Five Rings in your youth and then peruse it again in midlife, the sensation is not a recounting of emotion, but rather a newer and deeper understanding of what has been presented. This is what you're looking for. In fact, the Book of Five Rings is often placed alongside The Art of War by Sun Tzu, On War by General Karl von Clausewitz, Infantry Attacks by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, and Patterns of Conflict by Colonel John Boyd. Each of these works has materially influenced military thinking, directly or indirectly influencing modern combat, despite the fact that they were written decades or even centuries ago. In this sense, Musashi truly was a combative genius. Small wonder that our patron sword saint crossed over to become an icon, a legend. But what drove him? What brought him there? While he never wrote a book that we know of, Musashi's father Munisai was a famous martial artist in his own right. His very name means a man unequaled. After defeating a famous swordsman of the Yoshioka family in front of the shogun, Ashikaga Yoshiaki, he was honored with the title Hi no Shita Heihojutsu Sha, which translates as the greatest fighter tactician under the sun. He was also reported to be self-assured, aggressive, aloof, and domineering, and he firmly believed that his son was arrogant. It is easy to see that this combination of the autocrat and the arrogant would not mix well. Night and day, oil and water. And to be certain, it didn't. Musashi's father treated him poorly, ostensibly in order to bend him to his will. It didn't work. When he could no longer abide the strict rules of Munisai's household and treatment that he felt was beneath his station, Musashi ran away from home. He was only 8 years old at the time. It is reasonable to assume that he returned to his birthplace now and again, as it was a place of refuge after all. But once he had made his reputation by killing Kihei, he left his hometown never to return. We do not know if he ever spoke to a family member again, but it's likely a safe bet that he did not. With no meaningful relationships in his young life, he set out to borrow the battlefield, a term used by swordsmen wanting to prove themselves in combat and win a position within that domain. The cause, the lord under whose banner he fought, even the reason for war was not horribly important, but rather proving oneself by killing others was paramount. Let's think about this. No meaningful relationships, a self-selected loner, intense focus to the point of obsession, and a willingness to kill. Of course, we love Musashi. He is Clint Eastwood, Chuck Norris, Jason Statham, and Bruce Lee, all rolled into one badass mercenary who roamed the land with a 3-foot razor blade searching out prey to slaughter. Wait a minute. On a movie screen that makes for a rousing good time, but in real life, it sounds an awful lot like something a psychopath might do. Was Musashi a functional psychopath? We believe the answer to that question is a definitive yes. Surprised? You shouldn't be. Let's examine some of his behaviors. To begin, Musashi was ruthless. He sought out other men to murder. He didn't kill to defend his life, his property, or even his liegelord. He killed simply to test his skill in battle. He killed to improve his reputation and status in life. He killed because he could. And he was very good at it. Musashi was fearless, another common attribute of functional psychopaths. Fearlessness can be good or bad. It's not the trait so much as how it is used and perceived. An example of this might be the Zodiac Killer, who terrorized Northern California in the late 60s and early 70s. The Zodiac Killer, in at least one documented instance, walked up to his victims in broad daylight and shot them to death. Then he taunted police with cryptic messages. Fearless for certain, but not in a good way. Contrast this with members of elite military units or law enforcement operators who overcome long odds and complete hazardous assignments in part due to fearlessness that lets them focus on the job despite the dangers they face. It's not that they never get scared, but rather that they never let their fears stop them. Musashi clearly embraced the adage, "A samurai never fears death." The ability to be and stay mentally focused was a key to Musashi developing and honing his skills as a swordsman. This mental discipline led to the development of his innovative two-sword system, a style that was unheard of in the orthodox sword schools of his time. In fact, Musashi's focus was similar to that of Michelangelo dai Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni. It is said that while sculpting, the famous Renaissance artist would not bathe or change his clothes for weeks at a time. When Michelangelo would finally remove his footwear, layers of skin would fall off his feet and remain with the boots. Just as Michelangelo's focus was so intense that it caused him to forget about simple hygiene, so was Musashi's. Wild, unkempt hair, rumpled, sweat-stained clothes, a disfiguring skin condition, and a 1,000-yard stare were common descriptions of the master swordsman. An absolute lack of conscience is another attribute of a psychopath. At no time does Musashi speak about being fair or just in his writings. His only focus was on how to win. He saw the world as a very utilitarian place. At no time did he ever express remorse either. It is our belief that Musashi never lost one moment of sleep over the people that he killed, the families that he disrupted, or the damage that he had done. Sure, he lived in a different time, was held to a different set of standards and ethics, but even in warrior societies, it's not easy to wantonly go around killing people with no remorse. Insofar as we can tell, the only remorse that Musashi ever experienced was not being even better, more efficient at slaughtering other human beings. Musashi's actions throughout his life benefited himself first and foremost. Some might point to his writings as a deed designed to assist his disciples, and we would agree. But in many ways they were self-serving too. While his books may not have been propaganda per se, everything was described through the lens of his own perspective. Musashi's life was about himself, his swords, and finding increasingly efficient and effective ways to use them. He was detached from society, rarely stayed long-term in the company of others. He did not depend on others, never formed any lasting romantic relationships, and lived alone the majority of his time. In fact, in his last writings he addressed the fact, in his opinion, that one should never be guided by love, filial or romantic. In today's world, we are able to obtain vast amounts of data about crimes and criminals over the internet. When we search for the information on serial killers or news reports of violent crimes can be obtained almost immediately. While early reports can be suspect, much of what is reported in the early minutes and hours ultimately proves accurate, because reporters have an easy time finding relevant and meaningful information nearly instantly. Pick a criminal, any violent criminal, and perform a background check. Within moments, we can uncover a history of antisocial behaviors. Sometimes these behaviors originate from nature, other times from nurture, but they're virtually always present. Every violent crime has a backstory, and oftentimes the criminal has a history of antisocial behaviors stemming from childhood. It is well known that Musashi's father was an autocrat who dictated the terms of his household and martial arts school. From our modern perspective, it must have been very hard to live in that household. This is speculation on the part of the authors, but it requires consideration. Is it possible that Musashi's father, a teacher of martial arts and an observer of people's temperaments, saw something in his son that was undesirable? Is it possible Musashi's father saw a nascent psychopath, but only knew to call the behaviors arrogance since modern psychological science was unknown to him? Is it possible that this father chose to be hard on Musashi because it was the only way he knew to suppress the undesirable conduct his son exhibited? And finally, is it possible that his father's actions only fueled Musashi's antisocial behaviors? So what is a psychopath really? The Merriam-Webster dictionary offers a brief and clear definition: a person who is mentally ill, who does not care about other people, and who is usually dangerous or violent. This simple template fits much of what we know about Musashi. However, as much as we might want to categorize him as a functional psychopath, doing so still has some wiggle room. Consider this. On July 22, 2011, Norwegian national Anders Behring Breivik killed 8 people with a bomb and then hunted down and shot 69 participants at a worker youth league summer camp. 2 court-appointed psychiatric teams, who extensively came to 2 different conclusions about the state of his mental health. If nothing else, these differences prove that even what we might conclude as an open and shut case of insanity, of aberrant psychopathic behavior, may not be. However, even though we are not psychologists and obviously spent no time examining Musashi in the flesh, we stand by our conclusions. Musashi was a functional psychopath. To prove our point, we use a checklist from someone far more qualified in the subject matter, Dr. Kevin Dutton. He's a psychologist, writer, and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oxford's Department of Experimental Psychology. His definition, which should sound eerily familiar to our earlier description of Musashi, includes the following elements: ruthlessness, fearlessness, ability to be and stay mentally focused, lack of conscience. So without question, Musashi was a functional psychopath. While we believe he was born predisposed to an antisocial personality disorder, we simultaneously acknowledge that Musashi was, beyond any shadow of a doubt, a genius. Can we separate the psychopath from the genius? Sure we can, but it is a bit of a challenge. Once we move past the acknowledgement that Musashi was a psychopath, it places his writings in a different light. When we read Musashi's writings, Go-Rin no Sho, or Dokodo, we are reading the thoughts of a functional psychopath. Should we, therefore, accept his writings in totality? Clearly not. No more than we would accept the policies of the Nazi Party in total, just because we like the way they addressed German citizens' access to healthcare. But that's the point, isn't it? We should feel free to embrace the uncomfortable, to move past the icon of Musashi constructed by Eiji Yoshikawa some 70 years ago. Engage with the essentials of the master swordsman's teachings, his meaningful messages, all the while keeping a balance between the value of the icon and the reality of who he was as a man. In other words, he wrote about a different time and place, a different culture and ethic. There is merit in much of what he said, but his words are not a Bible. Many people know about Musashi's first book, Go-Rin no Sho, and have even studied it in depth, but far fewer have perused his second one. On the occasion of Musashi giving away his possessions in preparation for his impending death, he wrote down his final thoughts about life in a treatise he called Dokodo for his favorite student, Taro Maganojo, to whom Go-Rin no Sho had also been dedicated. The title Dokodo translates as The Way of Walking Alone. It is a short essay containing a mere 21 passages, yet it is just as profound as his longer dissertation. The book you hold in your hands is our interpretation of that final work. When reading famous historical writings, readers are oftentimes subject to a single person's perspective about what an author from the past had to say. For instance, it might be the one person who spent the time and energy to translate an ancient work, such as Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor from 161 to 180 AD. Although the translator is unlikely to deliberately alter a statement or modify a meaning, there is always room for interpretation and opportunities for error. If the translator was an academic, for example, we get a scholarly view. If he or she was a military historian, on the other hand, the perspective would be different. Either way, there's one lens, one point of view. We've tried to be more holistic here. This translation of Musashi's precepts comes from the public domain. We saw no need to quibble with precise wording when each passage spans but a single sentence, yet this book contains 5 different interpretations of each precept of the Dokodo, written by 5 martial artists who come from very different walks of life. Each contributor was selected because he or she has lived a divergent and existence from the others, yet shares the commonality of being a lifelong martial practitioner and published author. We will address each of the 21 precepts in turn, taking the perspective of a monk, written by Franciscan friar Chris Wilder, a warrior, written by former U.S. Army sniper instructor Alain Barrace, a teacher, written by educator Wallace Smedley, an insurance executive, written by claims examiner Lisa Christensen, and a businessman, written by IT strategist Lawrence Kane, in our analysis. As you read this treatise, you will see how some of these views agree with what Musashi has written, how we have found modern relevance from the legendary swordsman's final words, as well as where some of our views differ. Or, in some cases, where one or more authors might have rejected Musashi's position entirely. In this fashion, you're not just reading a translation of Musashi's writing. You are scrutinizing his final words for deeper meaning. For all his faults, Musashi was a genius, one whose writings merit deep consideration. Our goal is to make you think, to help you find modern meaning and application from Dokodo for your own life as we have done for ours. Enjoy.